Alright, here's the deal. When I first met Sarah at training camp, all I cared about was proving myself, pushing harder than anyone else. But she? She wasn't like the others, strong, confident, and yeah, absolutely captivating. At first, we were pure rivals, pushing each other to the edge. But then, things shifted. It was no longer about beating her but about being by her side. Then there was Ethan, a guy who couldn't stand seeing us close. Tensions rose, words were thrown, and it all built up to something I never saw coming. This story? You've gotta hear it. When I first saw her at training camp, my mind was entirely on the grueling challenges we were set to face. I had one focus: to prove myself and push my limits. Nothing else mattered, at least, that was what I told myself. Then, she appeared, and in a matter of minutes, I knew I was wrong. She had this way about her, like she knew exactly what she wanted and nothing would stop her from getting it. Her name was Sarah, and the moment she introduced herself to the squad, every guy in the room turned to look. There was a confidence in her eyes that made her stand out immediately, and something about her told me that she had just as much to prove as I did. I watched her with a competitive edge at first, feeling an immediate instinct to push myself to be better than her. In training exercises, I would catch her eye and feel this surge of adrenaline, trying to stay a step ahead of her, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. But every single time, just when I thought I had an advantage, she would surprise me by taking it one notch further. She was relentless, focused, and, almost annoyingly, always right by my side, if not a step in front of me. It was not long before our rivalry became the talk of the camp. The squad leaders even seemed to notice our competitive energy, and I could have sworn they started pairing us up on purpose, testing us in team challenges to see who would break first. I hated that I was so caught up with her, but the frustration only made me work harder. It felt like every muscle, every ounce of my stamina, was wrapped up in trying to outdo her. One day, we were paired together for a team-building exercise. The assignment was grueling and required complete focus and trust in each other. We had to carry heavy loads across an obstacle course and support each other through every step. At first, neither of us spoke. We were so used to seeing each other as competition that it felt strange to rely on each other. But slowly, we found a rhythm. I caught myself noticing things I had not before, like how she always carried herself with a quiet strength, or how she was there, steady and unfazed, every time I thought I might falter. At one point, we reached a particularly difficult stretch, a steep hill, muddy and slippery from recent rain. I felt my boot slide, and before I could steady myself, Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip firm and unwavering. "You good, Jake?" she asked, a faint smirk on her lips. I nodded, a bit taken aback by her strength, and for the first time, something shifted. She was not just another soldier. She was someone I wanted to impress. Someone I needed by my side. As we reached the end of the course, covered in mud and completely exhausted, we dropped to the ground, leaning against a wall to catch our breath. For a moment, everything around us faded, and it was just the two of us. She looked over at me and said with a slight grin, "You are not half bad, Jake." Something in her tone, a light-hearted tease, threw me off guard, and I could not help but laugh. For the first time, I saw her as more than a competitor. There was a warmth in her eyes that I had not noticed before, and I found myself wanting to know more about her. From that day on, we started talking more. It began with quick conversations after drills, then turned into grabbing dinner together in the mess hall. We would talk about everything: our families, what drove us to be here, and the dreams we had yet to chase. Sarah opened up about her past, sharing stories of her younger brother, her mom, and the challenges that had shaped her. I realized she was driven by more than ambition. She had a depth that I could not ignore. Meanwhile, the other guys noticed our connection. It was obvious that Sarah was the center of attention in our squad, and I was not the only one vying for her time. There was one guy, in particular, who grated on me every time he talked to her: Ethan. Ethan was one of those guys who always seemed to have the right words, the easy smile, the perfect joke. He was known for his athleticism and natural charm, and he made no effort to hide his interest in Sarah. One evening, after a particularly tough training, Ethan invited her to a gathering some of the guys were organizing. I watched as she accepted, a polite smile on her face, and felt a surge of frustration. I knew I could not stop her from spending time with others, but the thought of Ethan trying to win her over was a bitter pill to swallow. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing the two of them laughing, getting close, and it only fueled my determination to prove myself in every way. The next morning, we were back in training, and I pushed myself harder than ever. Every time Ethan tried to catch her attention, I would be right there, outperforming him. I did not care if anyone noticed my intensity. I was focused on one thing, showing Sarah that I was the one she could count on. I could see her watching, a hint of curiosity in her eyes as she noticed my drive. As the days went on, I realized I could not keep my feelings hidden much longer. One night, we were the last two left in the mess hall. The others had already headed back to their bunks, but we lingered, our conversation stretching on as it always seemed to. The quiet of the empty hall gave me a surge of courage, and without thinking too much about it, I leaned in, my voice low but steady. "Sarah," I said, meeting her gaze, "I know we started off as rivals, and maybe that pushed me to try harder. But it is more than that now. I cannot just stand by while everyone else tries to get close to you. You mean something to me." The words felt raw, honest, and for the first time, I was not worried about how she might respond. She looked at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before a gentle smile crossed her lips. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I was wondering when you would realize that." The weight of her words hit me like a jolt. She had noticed my efforts, my drive, and somehow, she understood everything I had been holding back. From that moment on, our bond became unspoken but undeniable. Even though we did not show it openly, everyone around us could sense it. Ethan tried a few more times to win her over, but now, every time he approached, Sarah would glance my way, as if reminding me that she saw me, really saw me. It was as if a silent promise had been made, one that neither of us needed to say aloud. From that point on, my focus sharpened even more. Sarah and I had something that no one else could touch, something that set me on fire every time we trained, every time I caught her eye across the camp. But with it came the realization that others were also watching. The guys started noticing the change between us, and some did not take it well, especially Ethan. He was competitive, and not just in training. When it came to Sarah, he was relentless, and every time he found a way to get her attention, I felt the sting of it. One weekend, the squad was given a rare day off, and a group of us decided to head to the nearby town to blow off steam. I was hoping to get some time alone with Sarah, maybe grab a coffee or just talk without the constant interruptions. But the minute we reached town, Ethan managed to cut in, striking up a conversation with her and suggesting a small diner he said had the best burgers. She laughed, seeming genuinely interested, and I felt a knot tightening in my chest. I was about to step in and join them when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was my buddy Mike, giving me a look. "Let it go, Jake," he said quietly, as if he could read my mind. "If she is interested in you, you have nothing to worry about." But it was not that simple. I could not just let go, could not just sit by and watch as someone else took her attention. I was torn between giving her the space to decide and wanting to claim my place by her side. After a long internal debate, I ended up walking into the diner after them, joining the table without asking. Ethan shot me a look, but Sarah only smiled, and that small gesture was enough to keep me grounded. She had noticed me, chosen me, even in that small way. The next day, our squad leaders scheduled an intense training session that was intended to push us to our limits. We were split into pairs again, and this time, thankfully, Sarah and I ended up together. It was as if the universe was giving us a chance to prove ourselves as a team, and I was not about to let it go to waste. We were assigned a series of endurance tests, long-distance runs with weighted packs, followed by obstacle courses, and ending with close combat drills. It was exhausting, but being paired with her, I felt a surge of adrenaline that kept me going. As we navigated each challenge, I found myself marveling at her. Sarah was unstoppable, pushing through every obstacle with determination and grit. At one point, we hit a mud trench, and as we climbed out, I lost my grip and started to slide back down. Before I could steady myself, she reached out, grabbing my arm and pulling me up with a strength that caught me off guard. "You are not giving up on me, are you, Jake?" she teased, her voice breathless but steady. I managed to grin, shaking off the mud and matching her stride as we continued the course. By the end, we were both covered head to toe in dirt and sweat, but we had done it. We had completed every part of the course together, side by side. After the exercise, we were given a few minutes to rest. Sarah and I found a spot away from the others, sitting on a low wall, catching our breath in silence. It felt like a private victory, a quiet moment just for us. I glanced over, and for a second, she looked back at me with a softness that took me off guard. "Thanks for having my back out there," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, but unable to hide the gratitude. "Anytime," she replied, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. She paused, looking down at her hands, then added, "You know, I was not sure about you when we first met. Thought you were just another guy trying to show off. But you are different, Jake. You actually care about what you are doing." Her words hit me hard. Coming from her, it meant more than any award, any recognition I had ever received. I could feel my heart pounding, but before I could say anything, a voice interrupted us. "Ethan, of course. There you two are," he said, walking up with that smug grin of his. "Thought I would find you sneaking off somewhere." He laughed, but there was a tension in his eyes. "Sarah, some of us are planning to grab dinner tonight. You in?" She looked at me for a moment, as if gauging my reaction, then shrugged. "Sure, sounds good," she replied. It was casual, friendly, but I could feel the sting. I wanted to ask her to spend time with me, to choose me over them, but I knew that would only make things harder. I needed to let her decide. That evening, I was on edge, trying to focus on my own things, but my mind kept drifting back to her. The other guys were out, probably sitting around a table somewhere, and I could not shake the feeling that maybe I should have done something more to show her what she meant to me. Just as I was about to head to bed, my phone buzzed. I checked it and saw a text from Sarah. "Hey, you up for a walk? Need some air?" I did not hesitate. Within minutes, I was out the door, my heart racing as I spotted her waiting near the training field. She looked up as I approached, a soft smile playing on her lips. We started walking, the silence comfortable, but charged with an energy that felt new, different. After a few minutes, she glanced over at me. "Jake, why did you join the squad?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. I paused, surprised by the question, but realizing it was something I had never really told her. "I joined because I wanted to push myself, to find out who I really am," I admitted. "I thought I could handle anything, but being here, meeting you, it has made me question things, made me want more than just another accomplishment." She stopped walking, turning to face me, her expression unreadable. "I joined because I wanted to be strong, to prove that I did not need anyone," she said quietly. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it is not about doing everything alone." Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew. I could feel it, that unspoken connection between us, the weight of everything we had been through, the silent understanding that we were more than just training partners. Slowly, I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my hand lingering. I wanted to say something, to tell her everything I felt, but I was afraid of breaking the moment. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, she took a small step closer. I could feel her warmth, her presence grounding me, steadying me in a way that nothing else could. Before I could think, I leaned in, and our lips met, soft and uncertain at first, then deeper, like we were both releasing everything we had held back. It felt right, like something I had been waiting for without even knowing it. When we finally pulled apart, she looked up at me, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I have wanted this too. I wanted to be sure." I held her close, my heart racing as I realized that I had finally found something worth fighting for, something real. This was not just a fleeting connection, not just a passing romance born from the intensity of training. This was something deeper, something that felt like home. After that night, everything felt different. Sarah and I were still surrounded by the same routines, the same relentless pace of training and drills, but we had this quiet understanding that nobody else could touch. There was a depth to our connection now, a comfort in knowing that we were no longer just partners in the field but something more. It gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond the work. Still, the intensity of the camp meant that we had little time to be alone. We stole moments where we could, meeting in quiet corners, catching each other's eye across the field, sharing quick glances that said more than any words could. There was a thrill in it, a kind of private, unspoken bond. But not everyone was oblivious. Ethan seemed to notice immediately. If he was annoyed before, now he was outright hostile. I could see it in the way he watched us, the way he inserted himself into every possible moment, trying to get between us. He was not subtle, and his competitive nature made him increasingly insistent. He was not one to take no for an answer. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling endurance test, Ethan approached Sarah while we were cooling down. I was close enough to hear him but far enough away that it would not seem like I was eavesdropping. "Sarah, want to join me for a workout later? Could be fun. I think we could make a solid team." He smiled, that familiar confidence in his voice. It was casual, but his eyes lingered on her just a little too long, his tone suggestive. I watched as she shook her head, glancing briefly in my direction before responding. "Thanks, Ethan, but I am good," she replied, her tone polite but firm. He shrugged, but I saw a flash of frustration cross his face. He muttered something under his breath, then turned and walked away, throwing me a hard look as he passed. I ignored him, focusing instead on Sarah, feeling a strange combination of pride and protectiveness. She had chosen to be with me, and there was nothing he could do about it. But Ethan was not ready to back down so easily. A few days later, during a tactical exercise, he decided to test me directly. We were in teams, racing through a course designed to mimic real combat scenarios. It was a test of agility, strategy, and teamwork, and Ethan and I were assigned to different groups. From the start, it was clear he had made it his mission to outdo me at every turn. He charged ahead, pushing his team forward, glancing back at me with that challenging smirk. I kept my focus, determined not to let him get under my skin. But he was relentless, goading me every chance he got. Halfway through the course, we reached a steep incline, one of the toughest sections of the field. My team was trailing behind, but I knew we could make up the distance if we kept pushing. As we started the climb, I could see Ethan and his team just ahead, struggling against the weight of their packs. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, spotting me catching up. He shot me a look, something dark and competitive flashing in his eyes. He was not about to let me close the gap. I watched as he increased his pace, almost to the point of recklessness, urging his team forward with a fierce intensity. I had to admit, he was skilled, but his arrogance was starting to wear thin. We kept climbing, the heat and the weight pressing down on us, and just when I thought we might reach the top, I heard a scuffle behind me. I glanced back and saw one of my teammates struggling with his footing, his pack threatening to pull him backward. Without thinking, I dropped back, grabbing his arm and steadying him, taking some of the weight. It slowed us down, but there was no way I was leaving anyone behind. Ethan saw the struggle and seized the opportunity, urging his team to move even faster, putting more distance between us. He glanced back again, smirking as he gained ground. I clenched my jaw, pushing aside the frustration. This was not just about competition. For me, it was about doing what was right, about having each other's backs. I could not let Ethan's ego get in the way of my principles. By the time we reached the top, Ethan's team had finished the course. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he watched us arrive a few moments later. As I stepped off the incline, he walked up to me, clapping me on the shoulder in a way that was anything but friendly. "Tough break, Jake," he said, grinning. "Maybe next time, if you don't slow down for the weak links, you might stand a chance." I felt a surge of anger, but I held it back, keeping my gaze steady. "It is not about winning, Ethan," I replied, my voice calm. "It is about making sure everyone finishes the course. That is what being part of a team means." He scoffed, his smirk fading slightly. "Maybe, but out here, it is every man for himself." I shook my head, feeling a deep sense of conviction. "Not for me. And I am pretty sure Sarah feels the same way." I did not say it to provoke him, but his expression darkened, and I could tell I had struck a nerve. From that day on, Ethan's rivalry became more personal. He was not just trying to win Sarah's attention, he was trying to undermine me at every turn. In training drills, in strategy sessions, he found ways to challenge me, subtly and not so subtly, trying to make me look weak or incapable. It was childish, but his persistence was starting to get under my skin. One evening, as I was walking back to the barracks, Sarah caught up with me, her brow furrowed in concern. "I saw what happened today," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Ethan is crossing a line, and you should not have to put up with that." I shrugged, trying to downplay it. "He is just determined. Thinks he can get to me." She looked at me intently, her eyes serious. "Jake, you should not have to deal with this alone. He has no right to try and push you around like that. You do not need to prove yourself to him." There was a fierce protectiveness in her voice, and I felt a warmth in my chest, knowing she was on my side. "I appreciate that," I replied, meeting her gaze. "But he does not scare me. Honestly, he is just fuel for me to keep going." She smiled, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You really do not let anything get to you, do you?" I laughed, the tension melting away in her presence. "Not when I have someone like you in my corner." She reached out, taking my hand for a moment, a small gesture that meant everything. In that quiet moment, I realized that whatever Ethan did, however much he tried to get between us, it did not matter. Sarah and I had something solid, something that could not be shaken by anyone else's ego. The next day, we were back in training, pushing through a combat simulation drill that was meant to test our endurance and teamwork. We were paired off into small squads, and this time, luck was on my side. I ended up with Sarah in my group, while Ethan was assigned to another. As we moved through the drill, navigating obstacles and covering each other, I could feel our teamwork syncing up in a way that felt effortless. It was as if we could read each other's movements, anticipate each other's decisions before they happened. She would cover me as I moved forward, and when she needed support, I was right there. About halfway through, we found ourselves in a makeshift bunker, taking a moment to catch our breath. Sarah glanced over at me, her expression focused but relaxed, and I felt a surge of pride. She was more than just my partner, she was my equal, someone I could trust completely. Then, as if on cue, a flare shot up from the opposite side of the field, signaling the end of the drill. We emerged from the bunker, tired but victorious, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment that was ours alone. As we regrouped with the others, I saw Ethan watching us, his face tight with frustration. He had seen our teamwork, our connection, and it clearly bothered him. But I felt nothing but satisfaction, knowing that Sarah and I had proven ourselves as a team, regardless of his attempts to undermine us. That evening, as we sat together on the edge of the training field, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reached over, taking her hand in mine. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and in that simple, silent moment, I felt a peace I had never known before. Over the next few weeks, things seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Training continued to be demanding, pushing all of us to our limits, but I felt like I was handling it with a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah and I continued to be discreet but undeniably connected. Our squad mates had mostly accepted it, giving us knowing smiles here and there, and even Ethan seemed to ease off, at least, at first. One night, after a particularly grueling session, a few of us decided to unwind at a bar in town. It was the first time in ages we had a chance to let loose, laugh, and forget about the daily grind of training. Sarah and I sat close together, our shoulders touching, and though we kept our interactions casual, there was a charged undercurrent. About halfway through the evening, Ethan walked over to our table, a drink in his hand and that smug look back on his face. He was clearly aiming to stir something up, and I could sense it the moment he sat down across from us. "So, Jake," he said, his voice overly friendly, "I have been thinking a lot about that last drill. You really stepped up. Impressive, considering you were not exactly leading the charge." I kept my gaze level, refusing to rise to the bait. "Thanks, Ethan. We work well as a team. That is what it is all about, right?" He laughed, a hint of mockery in his tone. Sure. Teamwork. But sometimes it is about who has the guts to take control, you know? Not everyone has that." I clenched my jaw, glancing at Sarah, who gave me a subtle shake of her head. She was signaling for me to ignore him, but Ethan was not done. He leaned in, dropping his voice a notch, though his words were clearly meant to provoke. "And Sarah," he said, turning his attention to her, "I have to admit, you surprised me. I thought you would want a guy who, well, takes a little more initiative." His eyes darted over to me, his meaning clear. I felt my chest tighten, a surge of anger bubbling up that I struggled to control. But Sarah, calm and collected, simply met his gaze with a cool expression. "Ethan," she said evenly, "what I want is someone who shows up, every time, for the people they care about. That is what real strength is." He gave a short laugh, shrugging as if brushing off her words, but I could tell her response had hit a nerve. He muttered something under his breath, then got up and left our table, throwing one last glance over his shoulder. It was a look that told me he was not backing down anytime soon. After that encounter, I felt the weight of his presence more intensely during training. He was always there, lingering just close enough to make his presence known, his comments growing sharper, his behavior more passive-aggressive. At times, he would intentionally try to intercept Sarah and me during our downtime, as if to remind us he was still around, still in the running. Then came a day when everything seemed to come to a head. It was a hot afternoon, and we were running through a high-intensity course meant to simulate combat conditions. The drill was complex, involving close-quarters maneuvers, stealth tactics, and quick reflexes. As usual, Sarah and I found ourselves paired up, slipping into that effortless rhythm we had developed. She moved with a grace and precision that inspired me, and I pushed myself harder, wanting to keep up with her every step. But then Ethan made his move. In the middle of the drill, during a break in the action, he approached Sarah and said, loud enough for everyone around to hear, "Sarah, maybe you should consider switching partners. I know Jake is reliable, but if you want someone who can take things to the next level, maybe you need someone with a little more edge." The tension was immediate, every pair of eyes turning to watch. I could feel my pulse racing, a mixture of anger and embarrassment rising inside me. But before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, looking Ethan squarely in the eye. "Ethan," she said calmly, her voice steady, "what you call edge, I call ego. And I have no interest in being with someone who only thinks of themselves." The silence that followed was thick, every word hanging in the air. Ethan's face went from surprise to something close to anger, but he quickly masked it with a smirk, muttering something under his breath before stalking off. I let out a breath, relief and gratitude flooding through me as I looked at Sarah, who simply gave me a reassuring smile. But even as Ethan disappeared into the distance, I knew he would not let it go that easily. And I was right. A few days later, we were in the middle of a night training exercise, a navigation drill in complete darkness, with nothing but our instincts and each other to rely on. Sarah and I had been assigned to separate teams, something that had not happened in weeks, and it left me on edge. The forest around us was dense and silent, broken only by the occasional sound of movement as our teams spread out, working their way through the obstacles. At one point, I heard a faint rustling nearby, followed by voices. I couldn't make out the words, but something about the tone seemed off. I moved closer, using the trees as cover, and that's when I saw them, Sarah and Ethan, standing alone, just barely visible in the shadows. Ethan's voice was low but intense, his posture aggressive as he leaned in, trying to get her attention. "Come on, Sarah," he was saying, his voice a harsh whisper. "You cannot seriously be with him. You know I am the better choice. He does not have what it takes to be with someone like you." I felt a wave of anger surge through me, and before I knew it, I was stepping forward, my voice clear and steady. "Enough, Ethan." Both of them turned, surprise flashing across Sarah's face, while Ethan's expression hardened. He took a step back, his stance defensive but defiant. "What's the matter, Jake?" he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Afraid of a little competition?" I held his gaze, feeling every muscle tense, but I forced myself to stay calm. "This isn't a competition, Ethan. It's not about proving who's the toughest. It's about respect." He laughed, shaking his head. "Respect? That's rich, coming from you. You think you can just stroll in here and take what you want without earning it?" I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, her presence steadying me as I took a step closer to Ethan, my voice low but firm. "I didn't come here to take anything. I'm here because I belong here." And Sarah, she made her choice. Ethan's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between us. For a moment, it seemed like he might let it go, but then he lunged forward, shoving me back with a force that caught me off guard. "What's your problem, Ethan?" I demanded, steadying myself, my voice echoing through the quiet forest. My problem, he hissed, his voice a bitter whisper, is that you're not good enough. For her, for this squad, you're just playing at something you'll never understand. Without thinking, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. You don't know anything about me, Ethan. For a long moment, we stared each other down, the tension thick in the air. But just as I was about to respond, Sarah stepped between us, her expression firm, her voice calm. Enough, she said, her voice a quiet command that silenced us both. She looked first at Ethan, her gaze steady. Ethan, whatever this is, it ends here. I'm with Jake because he's real, because he doesn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Ethan held her gaze for a second, his expression faltering as her words hit home. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off, his footsteps fading into the darkness. As the silence settled over us, I let out a breath, feeling the weight of everything lift just a bit. Sarah turned to me, her expression softening, and I felt a surge of gratitude for her strength, her loyalty. You didn't have to do that, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. She smiled, reaching out to take my hand. Yes, I did, she replied, her tone gentle but certain. Because we're in this together. As the tension faded and the quiet of the forest settled around us, Sarah's hand stayed wrapped in mine, a steady, grounding warmth. The confrontation with Ethan had left my pulse racing, but now, standing there alone with her, it was a different kind of intensity. Her presence steadied me, but it also drew me in, an invisible pull that I felt in every part of my body. I took a step closer, feeling the forest quiet around us, every sound, every whisper of the wind amplifying the tension between us. I looked at her, and there was something in her gaze, something fierce, open, like she was letting down a guard I had not even realized was there. Her breathing was steady, her eyes searching mine, and in that moment, words felt completely unnecessary. The weight of what we had been through, everything that had built up between us, seemed to find its release as we stood there. Slowly, I reached up, brushing a lock of hair from her face, my hand lingering as I felt the warmth of her skin. She leaned into my touch, her eyes never leaving mine, and I could feel the electricity between us, a current that had been building for so long it was almost unbearable. And then, as if by some silent agreement, she closed the remaining distance between us. Her lips met mine, soft yet urgent, and in that instant, everything else fell away. The frustration, the rivalry, the unspoken tension, all of it dissolved as I kissed her, feeling her respond with a passion that matched my own. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and I could feel her heartbeat against mine, our breaths mingling as the world around us blurred into nothing. Our kisses deepened, becoming more intense, more insistent, as we lost ourselves in each other. There was a rawness to it, an unrestrained hunger that felt both exhilarating and inevitable. It was as if we had both been holding back for so long that now, with nothing standing in our way, we were free to express everything we had felt, all the emotions that had simmered beneath the surface. I lifted her slightly, guiding her back against the rough bark of a nearby tree, feeling her fingers weave into my hair as she pulled me closer. The feel of her body against mine, the taste of her lips, it all felt surreal, like a dream finally realized. She met my gaze for a split second, her eyes filled with a mixture of intensity and vulnerability, and I could see the same need reflected there. Neither of us spoke, there was no need for words. Every touch, every caress, every shared breath spoke volumes as we gave ourselves over to the moment. Her hands moved over my shoulders, her touch leaving a trail of fire that made my pulse quicken. I could feel her body melt into mine, her warmth enveloping me as the last barriers between us faded. We sank into each other completely, our movements slow and deliberate, savoring each moment as if it were something fragile and precious. The world around us seemed to fade away, and all I could feel, all I could focus on, was her, Sarah, here with me, in a way I had never imagined possible. Every touch, every whispered breath, drew us closer, binding us in a way that felt both new and deeply familiar. When we finally pulled back, breathless and tangled in each other's embrace, the intensity of what we had shared lingered in the air between us. I brushed a thumb along her cheek, her eyes meeting mine with a warmth and trust that took my breath away. In that quiet, stolen moment, I knew that what we had went far beyond attraction, beyond the thrill of rivalry. It was something real, something I knew I would fight for, just as fiercely as I had fought for her attention on the training field. Sarah leaned her forehead against mine, her breathing slowly returning to normal, a soft smile playing on her lips. I tightened my arms around her, reluctant to let go, and she rested her hands on my chest, her fingers tracing gentle patterns as we stood there in the fading light. "I knew from the moment I saw you that there was something special," I whispered, my voice low, almost a confession. She looked up, her eyes soft and full of unspoken emotion. "And I knew you were worth the wait," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words resonated deep inside me, filling me with a sense of certainty that I had never felt before. In that quiet moment, holding her close under the canopy of stars, I realized that this was just the beginning.